Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. Thanks for joining us today for keyboards and stuff. Is that what we're calling this?
Yeah, I like that.
Jacob Dupre is with me.
Hey.
Thanks for being here.
How's it going?
And we're going to talk about keyboards and stuff.
Yes.
So lots of people have studios these days, and it can be a useful thing to have a keyboard in the studio, even if you're not a keyboardist.
Right.
And that's primarily who we want to talk about today. Somebody like myself, I'm a guitar player. Went through college, music college, grad school, piano proficiency. You know, I can play a C chord, sometimes an A minor. But that's about the extent of it.
That's
you know?
good, man.
Yeah, you know.
That's good.
But it's useful to be able to sit down at a piano or a keyboard and either enter parts, even if it's step enter or whatever, or play little parts or whatever. The question is, what kind of keyboard to get for a studio? Do I need a grand piano? Do I need just a simple controller? I don't know where to start. And so I'm going to rely on your wisdom to help educate all of us on keyboards and stuff.
Sure. If I was specifically talking for you, you've already answered a couple of the questions I'd probably ask somebody if I didn't know anything, which was, you know, what kind of player are you? What's your experience level so far? Because that weighs heavily upon what you're going to get. You know, because if you're on the other side of the spectrum, somebody like me that started playing piano and a lot of specific piano repertoire, you know, that means I'm going to want things like weighted keys. I'm probably going to want at least 60 keys, maybe 88. Like, obviously for me though, I have smaller controllers with unweighted keys. I also have 88 key controllers with weighted keys so that when I want to play piano stuff, I can. But I also do this sort of quick entry, casual, just lay down a simple chord part or two thing. And I use a lot of unweighted keyboards for that stuff, you know, by Novation or Native Instruments. Arturia, they make several keyboards, 25, 49, 61 keys that are unweighted. So it sounds like probably for people kind of like you, that's probably a pretty good route to go. Because if you're not practicing and playing often, or just not a really proficient player already, you probably find weighted keys to like be a little unnecessary and kind of cumbersome. So having, again, and I like it too, just having a unweighted keyboard, MIDI controller that you can use to enter quick parts. Maybe you do some MIDI automation kind of tracking stuff where you have a fader or knob or two set to a certain parameter if you like doing live stuff like that. But otherwise, I mean, that's probably the best choice.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's dig a little deeper into that.
Sure.
So the difference is with an 88 key weighted keyboard like you're talking about, that's trying to simulate an acoustic piano, correct?
That's right.
And so going to be harder to play from a physical standpoint?
Harder maybe, yes, in a way, but it's more like you just have to have assimilated your technique to a different feel, right? Like with piano playing, a lot of the techniques, like playing a grand piano or acoustic piano with hammers and that resistance and the whole deal. It's a combination of some finger movement, but also arms, you know, and like using, not tensing and pushing down, but using natural weight of your arm. It's got to be this almost flowy kind of athletic thing that you have to be able to do to be able to play an instrument that's weighted and not get tired and of course it's just, again, like kind of like being an athlete, because playing a musical instrument is physical. You have to develop a resistance to be able to do that and like a strength to do it. With unweighted keys, you really generally just need even less. You know, like I almost feel like sometimes it's like typing, you know, rather than like playing a acoustic instrument or a weighted key instrument is a little more strenuous over time. And again, you have to watch how you're using your fingers and your arms. But with unweighted keys, yeah, you can just kind of casually play for a long time and probably not feel it as much.
Right, so just for playing in quick parts, want to do a melody, want to play a bass line in, want to hit some quick chords or whatever, that's going to be a good touch for somebody who's not an experienced keyboardist.
Yeah, and that's why one of the cool things is that they make, you know, keyboards that are just 25 keys or something. Because if that's really all you're doing, you probably don't need much more than a couple octaves. Although I find generally that, you know, the smallest controllers I use are 49 keys because, you know, you get a few more octaves.
Right.
And there's just more you can do with that.
So. Yeah, I always wonder, should I get something big enough so I can play with two hands? And I'm not sure I'm really even, you know, skilled enough to play with two hands, but the idea of needing that.
Yeah, and there is one other point that just occurred to me about needing more keys. There's the idea of key switches and different MIDI notes that are triggering things. And if people don't know this, you know, there's a lot of software instruments, I know you do, that, you know, a lot of times it's like the bottom 2 octaves of the piano, some of the range of the 88 key range, or higher, where you get notes that are specifically made to trigger certain things in the plugin. So if it's a string patch, maybe it's different articulations, like it can change from staccato to pits to tremolo, or if it's brass, it's different articulations. So that would maybe be a reason why you would want to have a controller that's a little bit larger. Because even if you're not, of course you can, for most plugins, map where those triggers are. So if you want to move them up an octave or two, but of course that's going to take away from your playing range, because you're going to have these notes that are not sounding pitches, but they're actually changing articulations or whatever. So for me, I know for sure when I'm programming strings or things like that that need those changes, I like the 88 key out usually, because then I know I've got my key switches, but I've also got the full range of the software instrument available. So for a lot of composers or people that want to get into scoring and stuff like that, even if they're not using the whole keyboard to play, that might be something they'd be interested in.
Yeah, interesting point. The other point I want to make sure that we're clear on is, even if you get a 25-note keyboard, 2 octaves, you can transpose that. So you can play bass on that, you can play flute or lead synth or whatever. I mean, you still can access all the keys, just not all of them simultaneously.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I do that kind of thing a lot. Like with my 49 key controller, like if I need to lay down an accompaniment part that's like piano or something, I'll kind of put it mid-rangey, but then if I want to play a more higher single line, just flip it up an octave or two and play that line on a separate track or merge them together. And so you can kind of, piece your parts together that way.
Right.
Really easily.
So you mentioned the idea of using some of the keys as switches, which many of, like you said, of the orchestral libraries and things do. And you also mentioned in passing some of the other controls that are on these keyboards. You look at those and you see all these knobs, and you see drum pads, and you see sliders, and you see switches. What's essential for somebody to have?
Essential in that way? Well, I would say, you really want to think about what you'll be using it for. Again, back to that question. Some people, especially the controllers like from Novation and others that are made for certain DAWs, are mixing from their DAW, from their keyboards. They're using knobs to pan and change different settings. They're using the faders to actually change the volume of different tracks and instruments, and all that's going through obviously MIDI CC, so that basically they can minimize the time they're using mouse and keyboard and do that. So if you are somebody like that, you probably want a good bit of stuff. You're probably going to at least want like maybe 8 faders with 8 encoder knobs underneath, which is kind of standard. Some come with more, some come with less. Like me personally, a lot of times I don't have like a full like setup with one DAW that I use to do everything, but I do like being able to map like, hey, I'd like to change the cutoff of this synth leading up into this part, and so I quickly map it to a fader or a knob, or I use the modulation for that. I'd say probably the bare minimum modulation wheel and pitch bend wheel are really important, because there are some controllers that are very minimal that will at least just have those 2 things. And maybe you have a few other assignable knobs or sort of things that move or spin or rotate, or there's all these kind of variations. There's ribbon controllers that you can do stuff. But then you also mentioned drum pads. So if you're somebody that's into electronic music or hip hop, or not just those genres, I mean, you can use those kind of pads for a lot of different things, for triggering samples, for playing anything basically that you're routing that way. You might like to have some pads, especially if you're kind of either you maybe use some MPC type things at one time, and you kind of have sort of a feel with drum pads and those kind of RGB lit up pads. That could be a good way to go. I know a lot of the controllers that can be really useful for live performance too, for triggering things like triggering loops and samples. I know we're talking about in the studio, but there may be people that get proficient enough and want to go do a one-man band thing and want to have something like that. Like you can be manipulating your sounds with faders and encoders. You can play the keyboard. You can trigger samples with a pad. So yeah, there's just a lot of possibilities.
Right. And playing off of that quick access to just lay little things down, having those pads to play in your kick snare, kick snare, kick snare. Right. It's a different thing doing that on those pads than it is on keys.
Yes.
There's just a different feel to it.
Totally different.
So another big question that I think about as I'm looking for a keyboard for my studio is, does a keyboard need to have sounds built in, or should I do everything in the computer with virtual instruments?
Interesting. Yeah, so we've really been talking specifically about MIDI controllers thus far, which are instruments that do not have internal sounds. So now we're really talking more about a digital piano or maybe a workstation or synthesizer that would have built-in sounds. But then your question, which one do you want? Again, always it's what will you be doing with it?
Sure.
You know, so if you really love software plugins and you like having internal instruments in your computer, and that's by far a majority what you use, you probably will just like to have a controller. It'll just be simpler and just take care of what you need, which is something to trigger those sounds. But if you're somebody that maybe you have a little bit more of a developed home studio where you have people come over and play and different musicians, and maybe you have buddies or friends that really like to play on an actual digital piano that has internal sounds that can be recorded direct, maybe you do want that. Or you know, maybe you just want to have the option of having a keyboard where obviously I could probably definitively say there's almost no keyboard out there that doesn't have some type of MIDI output. Pretty much they all do it. Controllers and digital pianos. So if you have a digital piano, you get both, right? You get internal sounds, but you also can control all your sounds in your computer with MIDI. Of course, what you may find for a lot of people is if you're not using that instrument to gig, or you find yourself not using the internal sounds in your studio setting very much, you may find that you're not really using the features fully. So, but again, it all depends. If maybe you're somebody that does want to have some sounds to play with internally. Maybe you don't want to always keep it in your studio. You know, maybe you want to travel with it or move it into the living room or something. And if you do, then you don't have to drag your computer in there with you.
Right.
To have a sound, you can just, you know, go in there, plug in some headphones and work out some ideas or something like that.
To me, that's a really important thing. I like being able to just walk in, hit the power switch on the keyboard, put the headphones on, and I've got sounds there without having to boot the computer, without having to have the monitors up and the mixer or whatever. And even just for writing music, that can be useful to play around with sounds and to hear things. So I do like that instant access aspect of it. The question would be one notch deeper, as you mentioned digital pianos there. You also talked about workstations, which are much more comprehensive. They have onboard recording capabilities, and if you're already in the studio, may or may not be the direction you want to go.
Sure.
But there also are synthesizers, which are much more sonically specific, let's say. Talk a little bit about that and when you might want to choose a synthesizer as your keyboard.
Well, I think if you want some of the sounds and the sort of sound palette that a lot of those come with, which is obviously different than a lot of digital pianos. Some of the digital pianos have synthesizers basically built into them too, especially a lot of the stage pianos, like, you know, Nord has piano and organ and synth, but a synthesizer generally in that category, it's really focused on that sonority of sounds, like that group of sounds. So basically for me, I think in a studio setting, if you want to have that kind of sound in your music, but you don't want to just rely on plugins and software, you'd maybe like to have something that's doing the real thing, if you know what I mean.
Yep,
you know, that's maybe a route you want to go then.
Right. I mean, there's nothing like playing bass on a Moog.
Exactly.
You know, that is a thing, right?
You hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what I'm getting at. There's a rawness and a realness to twisting the knobs, and I mean, even though I did kind of grow up with some of that, but I know obviously there are people that really know it better, and I've developed a love for it myself, even though I do obviously use a ton of software. But yeah, it's a fun thing. It actually is an experience in and of itself, rather than just, you know, click, click, plug in. I mean, again, they sound great. There are many great sounding plugins.
And big advantages to that, being able to save everything and
Totally.
recall and all that kind of stuff, absolutely.
Right, but maybe you're somebody that wants to have both. You know, maybe, you know, sometimes, again, kind of like you said, the composer that likes to have the piano with the internal sounds to work out ideas and just have that instant thing. You could get that out of a synthesizer for a whole different type of sound.
I see keyboards that have aftertouch, velocity, those type of extra control features built into the actual keys.
Right.
Are those essential for a non-keyboard player?
I don't know if they're essential. I think, again, it's kind of like a choice, you know. And so for people that maybe wouldn't know, aftertouch is just after you play the keys, you put it down a little more pressure and you're triggering something, you know, something that you have mapped to that actual motion. Some keyboards have monophonic aftertouch. where just, basically the whole keyboard is just together. Some have polyphonic now, which is pretty cool, where you could have weight on different sides and actually have all those notes be independent, which is pretty cool. I've used it some, and there's definitely some, there's applications in the studio, especially for people that are maybe doing scores and things like that want to, trigger a volume change or an articulation, something with that. But live performers may want to use it too. So if you're somebody that gets a digital piano that has that aftertouch, maybe you find applications for it playing live. But yeah, I think it really ends up being a choice. And again, you got to think about, what kind of musician, what kind of creator are you? And let your imagination roam wild with it. Like all the different things I could do. I could map this parameter here. I could use it with a synthesizer and trigger this thing or whatever. And
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, but if you're a non-player,
Yeah.
it takes skill to manipulate those performance features and things as well. So it takes some practice, takes some working with things. So that's got to be factored in there. So number of keys, type of keyboard, size of the keyboard, control options that are built in, optional control options, lots of things to consider.
Yes.
But if you break it down, take it step by step, and really start from what do I need? What do I want to accomplish? What do I want this keyboard to do for me?
Yes.
It'll help you to narrow that down. But another great option, contact your Sweetwater sales engineer. There's a whole world of keyboards available of all types, and certainly they can help guide you through the many different options and choose the correct one that's going to help you make the most music in your studio the most easily, if you will. And then start at sweetwater.com and check out all the keyboards that are available.
Yeah.
Jacob, thanks so much, man. You're the expert, and I appreciate being able to pick your brain on this topic because there's a whole world out there that can add so much to a studio.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us here today for Keyboards and Stuff.
Keyboards and
Keyboards and Stuff. I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater.